Welcome back to Buckeye Talk, and I fear I have set us up for failure. Buckeye Talk. Doug Lesmerises, Nathan Baird, and Stephen Means, embarking on an ambitious, crazy, impossible task, hopefully fun, hopefully more fun than homework. It is the ultimate Ohio State draft. These are the parameters. Ohio State has 90 players in its history who have been first-round NFL draft picks. The three of us are attempting to analyze those 90 players as prospects, as they were viewed when they left Ohio State and were preparing for the NFL. And then we are going to draft a first round of those players. We are going to draft 32 of the 90. We are attempting to put into context guys from the 30s and 40s and 50s with guys from the Woody era, with guys from the Cooper era, with guys from the modern day. Actually, there's not a ton of guys in the 30s, right? I think the first draft pick for Ohio State was like in 38. So listen, it's going to lean a little recent. What can we tell you? We're living in this world. So Don Scott's probably not going to get picked. No offense to the late, great Don Scott. But we're going to try, and the way we're thinking of it, and Nathan, we have tried to, like, what is this? What is this, Buckeye Talk? We are attempting in the modern day to think as modern day NFL GMs. We are not assigning anybody to teams because we don't want to have somebody go lower in our draft because we feel like the Detroit Lions really want to see what they have in Jared Goff, so they're not going to take Art Schlichter. Like, that's not what we're doing. We're just making 32 draft picks, but we're trying to think like if the draft was happening right now, and Hop Cassidy and Jack Tatum and Corey Stringer and Garrett Wilson and CJ Stroud were all in the player pool. What would current NFL teams do, Nathan? And this is a little bit difficult because the game has changed so much. The first Ohio State receiver taken in the first round didn't happen until the 90s. Meanwhile, they were like running first round running backs through every other year in the 50s and 60s. But we're trying to do it now. So we acknowledge positional value is going to come into this. And some of the guys back in the day who were viewed as great players, just the way the game is now, that's changed a little bit. So you're trying, well, how would people view Eddie George now? How would people view some of the great linemen Ohio State had in the early years now? That's what we're trying to do, Nathan. A modern lens, as if the draft pool for this right now draft was only these 90 guys in Ohio State history. Is it impossible, Nathan?
No, I mean, I'm really intrigued by this, and I think it's going to have a nice duality to it because, on the one hand, I think it's going to help us define. We throw around the term generational talent a lot. I think this is one of the ways you can define generational talent. Be like, oh, would he be a first round draft pick this year? Like, because it's someone who, even as styles of play change, up to a certain point, you could be a generational talent in the 30s and you might not get drafted now. I understand. But like anybody in the last, I don't know, 50 years or more of college football, like would that player still be considered an important, great player today? And this is one of the ways you help define that. But then also, it just gives us another peek of the evolution of the sport when you can talk about players who were drafted maybe number one overall and are now like, where would that person be drafted? There are players who were like top 5 draft picks who, as soon as I looked at this list, I'm like, oh, you know what? That made perfect sense. Like, I remember when that guy was like the number 5 overall pick in the draft. And today, that really looks like a second round pick at best, and it makes a lot of sense. So I'm intrigued by it from both levels. I think it gives us a way to just it's a more defined perspective on some of the players that we talk about as being great, and a way to kind of put our money where our mouth is on that. But also, it's going to demonstrate the changes that have happened in this sport.
We are expecting this to be multiple podcasts. We're not going to do all 32 picks on this episode. We think maybe we'll do 16 on this episode, 16 on the next. If we go real long, it might be 3 episodes. It might be 10, 10, and 12. Stephen, we are going to try to acknowledge history the best that we can, while also acknowledging we did not spend a week diving into the archives on this. But there's also an evolution of the game that's going to factor into this that just applies to the guys going backward. That, yes, part of it is our lack of knowledge, but part of it is, like, it's just hard to take a halfback from the 50s and try to evaluate that today because so much has changed.
Especially when you start baking in positional value. Like, you might have been the best running back of your era, but are you really going to take a running back with your first 3 picks? Same thing kind of goes for safety. Same thing kind of goes for linebacker. These positions that, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, even, 90s were the cream of the crop positions. Well, that's turned into quarterback, left tackle, edge rusher, and cornerback very quickly here. And so it's like some of this might just be simply getting the best value for a pick, especially with some of these guys who were like a lot of the legends in Ohio State history aren't necessarily playing positions now where there's habitually being guys taking the top 15 of an NFL draft, unfortunately.
We are also acknowledging how much the draft itself has changed. You go back to the archives, and it's like there's a story. I've been back in the Columbus Dispatch archives. If you get a library card to the Columbus Library, which you can do no matter where you live, you get free access to the Columbus Dispatch archive. And that's no slight to the plain dealers. Just like in 1950, who's writing more about the Ohio State Buckeyes, the Cleveland Plain Dealer, the Columbus Dispatch? So I'm going through the Columbus Dispatch archives, and there's stuff like you're looking, it's like, hey, what happened in the 1957 NFL draft? And you go in the archives, and it's like the day of the draft, there's a story about, hey, there's a horse running at the track, and hey, there's a boxing match, and there's a draft, and a guy got picked, and it's like there's no coverage. And now we think about what the NFL draft coverage is, trying to find out even the context of this guy was picked at this spot. What did the league think of him going into the draft? Was it a reach? Was it a value? Did they think it was a good draft, a weak draft, whatever? It's much harder to get in the old context. I did go through the first draft pick, Jim McDonald, the number 2 overall pick in 1938. Again, back in the old days, by the way, everybody was a quarterback / halfback / fullback / you don't even know what a guy is, and now you're trying to evaluate that by position. These are the 90 guys who have been drafted in Ohio State history in the first round. Quarterbacks, only 5. Running backs, 15. Receivers, 10. Joey Galloway in 1995 was the first. And by the way, Paul Warfield was a running back at Ohio State and got moved to receiver in the NFL and became a Hall of Famer, a Pro Football Hall of Famer. Joey Galloway was like the first true receiver drafted in the first round in 1995. There were 12 running backs who were taken in the first round before an Ohio State receiver was ever taken in the first round. And by the way, back in the day, guys were ends. And it's like, oh, he's a defensive end, but he also caught 4 passes that year. It's like, it's impossible to decide what guys are. Since then, since Joey Galloway, there have been 10 first-round receivers and only 3 first-round running backs for Ohio State. But yet overall, it's 15 running backs, 10 receivers. So Nathan, we're talking that you can see the evolution of the sport of football through the evolution of Ohio State football, Nathan. It's a good lens.
Yeah, but it's also still an interesting exercise to me because there's going to be guys who were at certain positions right as the league was kind of starting to fold one way or the other. So which side of that are we going to put some of these players on? Were these players still being accurately judged based on a more modern way of thinking, or was it a more antiquated way of thinking, or kind of now a way of thinking that's past in the NFL? I'm curious where we're going to put a couple of guys, if we're even going to put them in the top 32.
Yeah, only 2 tight ends drafted in the first round, and one of those tight ends, Doug France, was a tight end at Ohio State and was drafted, and the Rams took him and were like, you're a tackle, because he basically was a tackle at Ohio State. Ricky Dudley, the only real true first-round tight end in Ohio State history. Note to Jelani Thurman. Not that he shouldn't have come to Ohio State, but something for Jelani Thurman to shoot for. Offensive tackles, 13. That's the most consistent position, I think, in Ohio State history, because it's like, oh, who's this guy in the 50s getting drafted? It's like, oh, he's a prototypical tackle for the time. It's like, oh, who's the guy who just got drafted now? Paris Johnson. Oh, he's a prototypical tackle for the time. That's maybe the most consistent position, even though there kind of was a gap. Since Orlando Pace, the only 2 first-round tackles. Since Pace in 97, 2 first-round tackles. Taylor Decker in 2016, Paris Johnson this year. So that's not a ton. Interior offensive linemen, 4. Defensive ends, 10. Interior defensive linemen, 2. Linebackers, 9. Cornerbacks, 15. Another good group driven by the modern era, obviously. Safeties, 5. 3 Pro Football Hall of Famers who were drafted in the first round out of Ohio State: Jim Parker, Paul Warfield, Orlando Pace, a bunch of guys who were first-team All-Americans. By draft position, okay, we're going to wind up, Stephen, drafting 32 guys total. There have been, and let me get the right number here, I believe 36 guys overall. No, 38. There have been 38 guys overall taken in the top 10. So we could just do this of guys who were top 10 picks. There have been 19 Buckeyes, Stephen, who were top 5 NFL draft picks. So we might get through this initial episode and we haven't talked about anybody who didn't go in the top 5 of their own draft. However, I don't think we have to be limited to that. I don't, like, Stephen, as we evaluate this, if there's a guy, we're trying to acknowledge what the NFL thought, but if there's like a really deep draft and a bunch of quarterbacks went early versus maybe a shallow draft and a guy was a reach, like, I think it's okay for us to take a guy who went 12th in his own draft ahead of a guy who went 5th in his own draft if we feel like there's some real reasoning behind the evaluation of him as an NFL pick. But again, we're just talking about a bunch of guys who are actually in the top 5 or top 10.
I think there's going to be some top 5, top 10 guys who don't get drafted because of that reason. You always have to bake in the idea of why that person went so high, the positional value that year, how many good players at that position were there that year. Did somebody reach? Did a guy maybe drop a little bit? So, like, you think of a guy like Garyon Conley, who was a first-round draft pick, or somebody like, Damon Arnett. The context of why they went as high as they did in comparison to some other people who have clearly had better careers than they have had for different reasons, obviously, one on the field, one off the field, but they maybe went 27th while this person went 17th or this person went 10th.
And Nathan, we aren't going to apologize for this because we had to put this in some kind of box, but we're not drafting Chris Spielman because he was a second-round pick. We're not drafting Michael Thomas because he was a second-round pick. We're not drafting James Laurinaitis because he was a second-round pick. If we were doing this as Michigan, we would not be drafting Tom Brady because he was a 6th-round pick. We're trying to hit a window that is very difficult to hit. It's not how good they were in college, and it's not how good they were in the NFL. It's how they were perceived by the NFL coming out of college, which isn't the exact same thing as being first-team All-Big Ten, first-team All-American, and it's not the exact same thing as being a multiple-time All-Pro once you get to the league, right? So if we just opened it up to everybody with no parameters, and then it would be like, oh, no, well, I want to draft Terry McLaurin, who was in the 3rd round. It's like, man, like, how would we ever do that? So what we're trying, and we're getting the jump, frankly. Ohio State has the most first-round picks ever. They're going to get to 100 in 2 or 3 years, right? They have 10 left to get there. Yeah. We're creating something that we think should live when it's like, Ohio State has 100 first-round picks. What a great thing. We're getting a little bit of a jump on it, which is what we're doing. But that's what we're trying to acknowledge, Nathan. The cream of the crop of that first-round group. So if you're waiting for Spielman, you're not going to hear his name, but don't blame us, blame the NFL that didn't make him a first-round pick back in the day.
But honestly, still, I think this makes it a more interesting list to have maybe a more limited, because that's what's going to take us on this journey through college football in a more interesting way. Because I think if you do open it up to now including guys who are 2nd, 3rd, like just everybody who was an All-Pro or whatever, I don't know, that seems a little bit more simple. It's not as much what do I want to say, analysis on our part even necessarily, because it's like, oh, this guy who was like a 3-time Pro Bowler got drafted in the 4th round. Well, obviously you take him. Like, I think this is a more interesting exercise. I think we're gonna have some fun arguments here.
We also have to acknowledge that how they performed in the NFL is going to seep into this.
Sure.
You can't avoid it. Mm-hmm. And I'm trying, there are guys where your instinct is like, mostly it's with guys who maybe didn't perform up to expectations in the NFL. And you're trying to think, oh, well, I don't want to take that guy that high. Then you think, wait. What did they think when the guy was coming out of college? What did the league really think that he was going to be? And by the way, we will reach some point where we go, this is probably where Marv would go. So sorry to Marv that we didn't wait till he actually got to the league. But Marvin Harrison Jr., I have a feeling would, if you redo this when they get to 100, might wind up pretty high. All right, let's do this. I'm going to pick first, Nathan 2nd, Steven 3rd. No snake draft. So we'll go through in that order. We're not trying to win. You're not trying to sneak in a pick to mess up the other guy. You're not trying to think, oh, I really want this guy, so I'm going to take him 6 spots earlier than he should have gone. We want it to be a list. I don't know that anyone's ever done this before. But if someone says, hey, who are the best NFL draft prospects in Ohio State history? We want you to be able to reference this list and feel like it's some kind of guide. It's not going to be perfect, but it should be some kind of guide. And with that, we will start the clock on the Ultimate Ohio State Draft, brought to you by Buckeye Talk. And man, if we had a sponsor, we'd be getting such value out of this. Brought to you by Buckeye Talk and your product, which everybody loves and you should buy. Maybe we can go back and plug that in here. All right, I'm going to pick first. With the first pick in the Ultimate Ohio State Draft, Doug Lesmerises selects Orlando Pace, left tackle, Ohio State. I think this is indisputable. I did not spend much time on this, and I think, Stephen, you could argue that Orlando Pace has, from high school to the end of his NFL career, as perfect of a football career as anybody has ever had. He's a high school All-American. He starts his first game as a true freshman at Ohio State. He is a dominant, award-winning offensive lineman for 3 years. He is the overall number 1 pick. He is one of 3 Ohio State Buckeyes to have been the actual number 1 pick in an NFL draft. And then he goes on to a career that puts him in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. And he plays a premium position. He's not a quarterback, but he plays an absolute premium position. Stephen, I did not hesitate on Orlando Pace. What do you think of this pick?
I think the draft just started because that was pretty obvious at this point. I mean, as he's a 5-star dude who was a starter from day one. And we've seen other 5-star dudes follow the 5-star path, but like that path meant sitting down as a freshman, and it meant taking a step as a sophomore, and then finally being everything they're supposed to be as a junior, and then getting out of here. He was him from the moment he stepped on campus, and was him for 3 years, and then was him for a decade plus when he got to the Rams. So yeah, this is probably the most no-brainer pick. I don't understand anybody who would try to make a case for why he's not number 1.
The actual overall number 1 pick in 1997. Nathan, I almost think if you did this exercise and just said, let's have the ultimate NFL draft in the history of the league. I'm not saying Orlando Pace would be the number 1 pick in that, but I think he would be high. And I think he would have a chance to go as the first non-quarterback in any draft of any NFL draft ever. And we could talk about Lawrence Taylor, or we could talk about, other premium position guys, but
Derek Thomas.
But that's how good he was. Nathan, would he have been your number 1 pick here?
No question. I think there's one player on this list, and man, it's obviously a great list, but there's one player on this list who the consensus of football thought would say is the greatest to ever do what they do. The best at this position. He is the Babe Ruth, Michael Jordan, Tiger Woods, not of all football, but of being a left tackle, right? Like I think that if you were to poll people who pay attention to college football and the NFL, people who take it seriously, Orlando Pace is going to win that vote. And it happens to come at a position where in the modern NFL, you would see someone saying, not only is this already a premium position, this guy might just be the standard crusher. Like the guy that everyone else is going to be compared to, and it's going to be futility because no one's ever going to do this again. And when you add all that together, I thought there was no question who number 1 was.
Okay. I would be very curious from our texters to hear any disagreement on this, but I think this was obvious. And so we now go to Nathan Baird with pick number 2. And Stephen, as you said, I do think the draft starts here. Nathan, what you got?
Yeah, and I may just take it completely off the rails. I think this is where we could have an interesting argument because there's, as we've said many times in many discussions, there's basically 3 things that are at the top of the football shopping list. It's the quarterback, It's the guy that protects the quarterback, and it's the guy that comes after the quarterback. And we just took the guy who protects the quarterback. I think the quarterbacks will go fairly high here because of what has happened in recent Ohio State history. But the highest peak of recent Ohio State history is just the line of edge rushers. And now it's just a matter of, if you're picking at number 2 here, would you go with, I mean, there's any number of guys you could go with. I'm trying to put myself in the mindset of which one had the highest peak at the time he was being drafted. So I am going with the second pick of the all-time Ohio State NFL draft. The Nathan Bairds, the Bearded Beasts, select Chase Young, defensive end.
What do you think, Steven?
I don't hate it, but I do think there's enough options here that there's a couple of guys you could have taken with that number 2 pick, and 2 of them went number 2, and he's one of them. Because it's like, I understand the reason I think you go with Chase Young here. Well, at least the reason I would come up with if I was to choose Chase Young here is, compared to the other guys, Ohio State got the full version and full Chase Young experience in a way that you didn't feel like you got with the other 2 because of circumstance. With the other 2, whether it's injury or just teams deciding we don't want that man to kill us anymore, we didn't get the full experience. While with Chase, as I was mentioning with Orlando Pace, Chase had the normal 5-star. It's, as a freshman, you don't really do anything because they didn't really need him. As a sophomore, 10.5 sacks with messed up ankles. And then you're a Heisman Trophy finalist in year 3, and you're the best non-quarterback and maybe just the best overall prospect in your draft. And unfortunately, his NFL career hasn't gone that way since his rookie year because of injuries and whatnot. But at least it started off in a way where you were like, okay, he's going to continue what he was doing at the college level.
I think this is the right pick. I was looking at the ESPN draft ratings, just trying to find context. ESPN has numerical draft grades, like up to 100 that they assign to draft prospects every year. They started doing it in 2004, but I feel like early on they were giving out too high of numbers. It feels like they really hit their stride around 2007 or 2008. Just in comparison of the like from 2007 on, like that range, Chase Young has the highest draft grade of any Ohio State player. He's tied with Nick Bosa, but Nick Bosa had a season-ending injury that Chase Young didn't. And when I was going back, Nathan, and reading the draft people, I read Daniel Jeremiah. I think he's the best draft guy. I read his draft evaluation of Chase Young. We know that Chase Young went actually second in the 2020 NFL draft behind Joe Burrow, but Daniel Jeremiah had Chase Young graded as his number 1 player in that draft. And there was not a but. In his breakdown, Nathan, he had 6 sentences, none of them were negative. There's nothing, I don't think there was anything to quibble with. Now, the hard part is Chase Young didn't even have his 5th-year option picked up by the Commanders, which is hard to wrap your head around. But that's not what we're doing, Nathan. You had to really fight through the results and go back to the anticipation. And I think you made the right call here.
It's tough because the other guys that you would consider right here, who are the same position as him, do the same things. You already mentioned one of them, and then there's the other Bosa brother, and there's some other guys that you could mix. But comparing those 3 guys, Chase Young has clearly not done what those 2 guys have done. It started off good as a rookie, like the spark was there as a rookie. It looked like it was going to be a thing, and then the injuries hit, and it's just never come back for him. And he's still got time, obviously, but it has not built the momentum the way those other 2 guys did. But I think if you're going back and freezing that moment in time, and this is where, Doug, you're going to have a better perspective than either Steve or I, because obviously I started this beat for Young's 3rd year. Steven got to see him as a 2nd-year guy, as Bosa was on the way out, as Nick Bosa was on the way out. But it just, in my mind, all 3 of those guys were considered great, but Young was the one that when you watched him, you're like, oh, like, that's not fair. And the other guys too, but like there was just the highest peak of that seemed like it was Chase Young.
Chase was the guy the first minute he showed up as a true freshman. You were like, is that a 4th-year NFL defensive end?
Is that a person?
And that's not the only thing it's about.
That's eye test. I think there's I think there was like an interview session you guys did in the spring where he was telling you guys about how like he was sad because he hadn't had his growth spurt yet when he was like a 5'10" sixth grader. And at some point he was just like, I don't believe in the eye test. And I think Ari went, Chase, you are the eye test. And it's like, that's, yeah, dude. Like you're what people draw up and laugh. When I get on Madden and create a defensive end, I'm creating Chase Young.
I'm also still waiting for the growth
this
spurt.
is one of those where hang on, man. It'll come. Maybe we can have Chase Young zoom in and give Nathan some words of motivation. This was like the big thing that like it snapped my head around when Chase Young had been at like one Ohio State practice and Jalen Holmes said he's going to be the first pick in the draft one day. And I was like, wait, what? What did you just say about a freshman who's been here for a week? And he was like, yeah, have you seen him? And he was on it. Like Jalen Holmes, who was as smart and tough and as observant a Buckeye as I've ever been around, was like, what are you? Yeah, of course. After a week, and he was right. He wasn't. It would have been. It's just quarterbacks. That's all. He was right, Nathan. So this is the pace, right? He's Orlando Pace on the defensive side, all the way up through the draft, which is where we're evaluating him. And then it hasn't gone in the NFL like it did for Orlando Pace, Nathan. But I think it's pretty much in lockstep with that kind of ceiling at the point that we are trying to evaluate Chase Young here.
By the way, I don't think we talked about this maybe on the Buckeye Fly effect because we did one on Haskins and Burrow, right? I think
yes,
something
we
along
did.
those lines.
We did.
But if Burrow stays at Ohio State and has Haskins' 2018 season comes out into that draft, Chase Young might have been the first pick overall in 2019.
Ohio State might have had number 1 and number 2.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
Nick went number 2 despite not playing that year.
Yeah, depending on if there was another quarterback that people wanted to overdraft. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So again, in the history of this, Ohio State, Chase Young is the number 2 pick in the 2020 draft. There have been 3 players taken number 1 out of Ohio State. There have been 4 players taken number 2. So he is one of the 7 highest actual draft picks in Ohio State history, and he goes off the board at number 2 here in our ultimate Ohio State draft. I think it's the right pick. Well done by Nathan Baird, which brings us, Stephen Means, to pick number 3.
I actually like that I'm 3rd, especially for this first round of first round draft picks. I like this. I get to do the thing that somebody in the top 5 always does, whether they trade up or they're just already in that spot, and that's reach for the quarterback. So, with that being said, with the 3rd pick in the 2023 Buckeye Talk first round NFL draft pick, the Mighty Means select Justin Fields, the Ohio State University. And I understand there's a reach there, but there's nothing more valuable at the draft time than quarterback. And he is, whether he's the best or not, we did a buck more on him. He's the most talented quarterback they've had here.
It's not how the NFL viewed him, though. He was the 5th or the 4th quarterback taken in his own draft.
Mm-hmm. But with Justin Fields, I didn't have
Justin Fields in my top 16.
Did you have a quarterback?
I'm trying to think how the NFL evaluated Justin Fields. And if we had coming out of college, Justin Fields versus all these other guys, he went behind Trey Lance. He went behind Zach Wilson, but he's going to go ahead of the Bosas.
But I think that's in
draft.
I think that's in relation to like what I think that comes into the relation of your draft, because we do that with quarterbacks all the time. Of like, would this quarterback be the number 1 pick in this draft if he was draft eligible right now? Or what if this crop of quarterbacks was coming out right now? Would they be number 1 or number 2? And the question, like, let's just take this 2023 draft to be: would Justin Fields be the number 1, the clear cut number 1 pick in this 2023 draft over Bryce Young?
No.
I think, what do we the NFL had questions about Justin Fields. Now the question is, like, should they have? Like, were they reasonable? The questions that they had about Justin Fields. And quarterback is the most valuable position. I do feel like there are multiple other guys who sort of didn't have questions about them, or as many questions at premium positions. Nathan, what do you think about Justin Fields here? Like we can talk this out. He is. I do think this is COVID, right? And there's a little bit of like not getting the opportunity to go crazy at the combine.
Mm-hmm.
Probably affected Justin Fields' draft status. But Nathan, just like what? How do you try to think in your head, Nathan, about what the NFL clearly did think about Justin Fields when he came out of Ohio State and what they should have thought? And if maybe the thing that was holding them back in a non-COVID year, looking at Justin Fields, the exact same prospect, is it possible that they would see him in a somewhat substantially different way?
I mean, I know there was no combine, but he came to pro day and ran a smoking number. I mean, probably I think it was about half of what Zach Harrison said that I would run in the 40. So pretty fast. And I just think that I agree with you that the passing questions were already there, and that has sort of been borne out in the NFL a little bit. Like, he's a very dynamic player overall. He isn't there as a passer yet. So I still think that I didn't have him as low as you, but I had him 10th.
So Steven, you are saying in your mind you think Justin Fields is the third best draft prospect in Ohio State history?
Yeah, when you make in the positional value and all those things, yes.
Okay.
I think it's worth.
Do you think?
But just real quick, I do think it is worth, if we're trying to put ourselves in the mindset of NFL GMs, people do overdraft quarterback. So I can see, even if you don't think he's the third best overall, I could see leaning, because I think I'm doing that a little bit with some of the guys that I've got coming up, that I don't know that this guy is better than a guy below him, but I know the NFL values him more at the top of a draft than the guy below him. But that being said, I don't think Fields would be the first quarterback off the board for me.
So here's the way I think of the Ohio. I don't think Ohio State yet has had a no doubt about it, checks every box quarterback draft prospect. I don't think they've had a guy like we just said, Daniel Jeremiah's evaluation of Chase Young didn't have a negative. I don't think Ohio State's had a quarterback like that yet. My first quarterback I had at 9, and I felt like the 8 guys ahead of him played in really valuable positions where I think as they came out, they would have been viewed by the league as having almost no faults. And so because I don't think Ohio State, I just don't think they've had quite, like a Trevor Lawrence type yet, or a Cam Newton, or like a guy who's just like that guy,
Andrew Luck.
And for that reason, I allowed the even though it's quarterback, I allowed the slam dunkness of some of the other guys to push them up my board ahead of any quarterback. And maybe Ohio State will have that guy someday. But I am, in trying to reflect what happened, the idea that he was the 11th pick, it required a team to trade up to get him, and Trevor Lawrence, Zach Wilson, and Trey Lance went ahead of him, did factor into my evaluation. Nathan, Steven, are you just thinking sort of like they were wrong? Like, I don't know what to tell you, NFL. Like, you were wrong. He should have been the second quarterback that year behind a guy who's like an awesome prospect.
I do think, that's like 15% of it, because it was like, he was that. He was the second, he was viewed consistently as the second quarterback in this draft until games stopped being played. And then we spent 3 months where that, for some reason, that was no longer the case. So that's got to be 15% of it, especially since, the two guys who were taken ahead of him that weren't maybe we weren't expecting to be taken ahead of him back in December of that year haven't really panned out. One because of injury, but the other one just because of like his actual play on the field. So that's some of this as well. But I understand where you're coming from. I think if I had the first pick, I think I would have more of that idea of like, just take the no doubt, no brainer guys at non-quarterback positions. But 3 and on, I think, is where you can get into you can reach a little bit more and just try. Like, I think of him, I view him the way that maybe like, Anthony Richardson was viewed in this draft, where he's like the the fourth pick in this draft, which he's not the first quarterback taken, but there's no first quarterback to be taken in this draft. But he's not the first player either. There's like a non-quarterback who went between him and where he went in this draft, and so that's where I view him in that range, is where there's two no-brainer. No doubt, when they were coming out, it's like those guys are going to be Hall of Famers as long as injuries don't get in the way. And I think those two guys went number one and number two. And then after that, you got to start baking in some positional value here. And that's why I ended up with Justin Fields being third instead of maybe waiting until the third round of this draft to take him.
I don't think it's revisionist history to say Fields was better.
When we
than
come
those
back,
guys.
go ahead.
We've talked about that before, and I think we were saying it at the time, and it wasn't just Ohio State beat that was saying that. I think there are people. A 49ers fan friend of mine was distressed that day that they were taking Trey Lance over him, and I had a lot of Bears fans who were excited that Fields fell that far. So it's not completely revisionist history to say he wasn't just the fourth best quarterback in that draft.
No, I think that's true. I mean, it's almost some of it that's a little harder to me is almost than like the non-quarterbacks that did go ahead of him.
Yeah.
That, J.C. Horn went ahead of him as a cornerback, number 8, when the Panthers didn't have a quarterback, and they a lot of pass catchers. That's a big pass catcher draft. Kyle Pitts, Jamar Chase, Jalen Waddle, Devontae Smith all went ahead of him. When we come back, I'm going to make the fourth pick, which might be part of a strong argument for why Fields at number 3 makes sense. We'll do that next on the Ultimate Ohio State Draft here on Buckeye Talk.